This is the start of our study on Revelation. When I mention Revelation to a lot of folks, I get a variety of responses. One is, I've never read the book, I don't know what's in it. Another is, it's confusing, I really don't understand what the big deal is. And another one is, that's really a dark book, I don't even know what to do with it. So we're going to unpack that a little bit because I think the most helpful response I've received thus far was actually from a pagan friend of mine. She said, "Okay, you want to do Revelation? That's great. So what is the main message of Revelation that no one else seems to understand and you think needs to be pronounced?" Without missing a beat, I said hope. Hope is the underlying focus of Revelation. It's not all the doom and destruction and the horsemen and the seven seals and all that symbolism. That's part of a genre. It's kind of like sci-fi in the first centuries. It has its own style of doing things. It has its own method. It has its own internal system. And it's not necessarily something that we recognize easily 2,000 years later. But it made a lot of sense in the first century. And that's where I want to start, in history, because the book of Revelation was not written for us. It was not written for the Victorians. It was not written for the Middle Ages. It was written for the Hebrew people and the early Christian people that were in the first centuries. The dating of Apocrypha as a literary style goes from about the second century before the Common Era up to about the second, third century of the Common Era. So that's about a 500-year period. And in that 500 years, Palestine was overrun by the Persians, then the Hellenists, who would eventually be part of the Greeks, and then the Romans. There was never a period of time in there where they were not a conquered people. And in addition to that, they had just returned from exile in Babylon just a couple of centuries before. So the idea that they were not able to be self-determining was a major part of the cultural identity of the first century. And they were looking for that to happen. And one of the things they came up with in the middle of that, which I allude to in the supplemental text that goes with this, is around the same time they were writing the Apocrypha, this understanding of the Messiah started to be developed. Messiah that we understand to be Jesus. But that was not the understanding of the early writers. They looked through Christian, or the Hebrew scriptures rather, and they looked to find passages in prophets, both the main prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah, as well as the minor prophets, to underscore this concept of a savior figure going to be born and raised and go to war with their enemies so that they would be freed. So you have Apocrypha and Messiah coming together at the same time. They couldn't help but influence each other. So by the time we get to the writing of Revelation, these are integrated concepts, which John, who was on Patmos at the time of writing some of his letters, decided to use to bolster the Christians, the proto-Christian community around him. Now, a word about John. John, who was of Patmos, we have no other way of identifying him, is not John the Apostle, and he is not the author of the pastoral letters of John. When the early centuries, about second or third century, the church fathers thought they were doing a kindness to the Bible and to believers. They assigned names to all the Gospels, most of the letters, and those got to be accepted. Prior to that, the Gospels were completely anonymous, and the only letters that were identified were those written by Paul. Even though many letters claimed to be written by Paul, only 7 of them actually were. So the early church fathers thought they were being kind and helpful to the faithful by assigning these names. And one of the things they did with all that is called conflation. They put people together that were separate. And one of the things they put together was the Johns. So John the Apostle as we hear from the Gospels, he lived quite a bit earlier than the writer of the epistles of John and the writer of Revelation. So right away we have to separate those into different people. The second thing about John from Patmos is that there's an assumption that he was a prisoner there during one of the persecutions of the emperor of the day. Now, the thing with the persecutions is that they were not consistent the way many of us were taught in Sunday school. They were rather inconsistent. They were sporadic. They'd rise up in one part and then fall away. There was not a conscious effort on the Roman government to wipe out Christianity. That never happened. So whatever this person, John, was doing on Patmos probably wasn't there as a prisoner. Now, it was a garrison community. It had originally been a place of worship for the goddess Artemis in Greek spirituality. And up on the top of the Acropolis, there was a high hill on Patmos. There was a temple there to Artemis. So if John of Patmos was a missionary, he could have been in Patmos to convert and convince the people there, or he could have gotten in trouble with the folks there, or he could have been spending time. There's no way of really knowing, and there's a lot of assumption around that. So I just want to parse that out a bit. So boiling that all together, we have an unknown person named John who spent some time on the island of Patmos writing in a style that was very much determined by that day and age. And he was not writing to us because the early Christian church really believed that Jesus would be coming back soon. That's one of the reasons why they discouraged marriage for a lot of their followers, because they didn't want to have children around, and they didn't think that people would be around long enough. If John was written close enough to the turn of the century, they probably thought that was the mark that everybody was looking forward to. The century, it was a substantial date, and then Jesus would come again, and it would be all done. The other part of situating Revelation in the first centuries is we're not really quite sure where, because he talks about the destruction and the building of a new temple. After the destruction of the second temple in 70 CE, the Hebrew community in Jerusalem was kicked out of Jerusalem, kicked out of a lot of Judah, actually. And they went further into other parts of the Mediterranean, and they developed their own culture where temple worship was not the central focus. But there is always a desire to rebuild. So if these people were Jesus followers at all, and they were reading apocryphal literature of hope about building a new city and a new temple and a new place of worship with all these riches and all this flash and magnificence, it kind of makes sense. It kind of goes together that the people that John was writing to were the people who were suffering of the day, the people who wanted to have their religion back. They wanted to have their government back. They wanted to have their land back. So that's the historic setting that we're walking into. Why John wrote it, as I said, could have been to encourage these people. But there's another part that is a little interesting. John of Patmos was most likely an Essene. And if you're familiar all with the Hebrew cults of the first century, there was the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and possibly more, but those were the big three. So the Sadducees were the landed gentry almost. They were the power brokers. They were the ones who sat in judgment and passed on titles and land and money to their families. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they were the learneds. They were the ones who might have been the sons of the common families who were identified as being particularly bright, and they were specially educated and then brought to the temple. And that was where they would make their money, earn their keep, by working in the temple in priesthood. There's a reason they would eventually become rabbis, and there was a reason Jesus was identified as rabbi at the time, because he had much the same kind of experience. This normal kid who had an opportunity to study, because we hear in Gospel of Luke, I believe, that that Jesus studied in the temple, so he had an opportunity to speak with the Pharisees and spend time with them. The third group were the Essenes, and the Essenes were supportive of Jesus' ministry far more than the Sadducees and the Pharisees were. The Essenes were purists. They were vegetarian. They shunned sexual activity. They were primarily male, possibly exclusively. They were the community that's highlighted most in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were potentially also the community that provided housing for Jesus and his followers as he moved through the Holy Land. And there's quite an assumption that John the Baptist was an Essene, and his people came over to Jesus' ministry after John baptized. In fact, we know that the Apostle Andrew continued over to Jesus' ministry after he was baptized. And John told him to go. That's where he should be. So the Essenes were very much purists, but they were not struck up in the laws the same way as the Sadducees and the Pharisees were. They were more lifestyle purists. And one of the things that Paul did relatively early on in his ministry after his conversion is he went into Gentile territory. Now, prior to that, the Jesus followers were only in Judah and Galilee. They weren't even in Samaria, really. And they were encrusted in the womb of the Hebrew tradition. Everything they did, even though they followed Jesus as the Messiah, was still very much in the lifestyle expectation of temple worship. Paul took this out, and he went to the Gentile community, and he went to the Greeks, and he went to the Romans, and he went to a lot of other people. And that really didn't sit well with some of those folks who wanted the Jesus tradition to be within the Hebrew culture of the day. And in Acts 15, we actually hear about a council in Jerusalem around the year 50, where Peter and Paul argued about circumcision and food restrictions. And eventually the council agreed that if they were not originally born within the Hebrew tradition, they couldn't put that on them. So they were not going to be putting on circumcision on adult men. And they were not going to be restricting the food choices of people who possibly made their living with food that was considered unclean by the Hebrew people. So Paul's ministry was to these folks. The Essenes would not have wanted that. So if John of Patmos was an Essene, he would have seen it as his responsibility to counter a lot of the teachings of Paul. And remember, neither of these men were working with the Gospels at that time. They were working with oral traditions, they were working with Hebrew scriptures, and they were working with some letters. But that was it. John of Patmos might have been familiar with the Gospel of Mark, but possibly not, because he would have been writing right around the time the Gospels were being written. So if he was coming into the churches in Asia that Paul had established and trying to tell them what they're doing wrong, that would have been a particular reason for why this entire book exists. Trying to correct what he perceived was an incorrect teaching. All of it, however, is under the guise of we've got to get rid of the Romans. Whether it's Nero he's talking about, who through his own negligence, Rome burned, and he blamed that on the Hebrews and the early Christ followers, or Domitian, who was reputed as being a horrible emperor, although history now says he probably wasn't as bad. He was probably just getting some really bad press from his political rivals. Whatever was going on, John was concentrated on developing the faith and the hope of a particular group of people in his time period, assuring them that one day, hopefully soon, they will see glory like they had never seen it before. This is the setup to Revelations. It is a historic book. It is not predicting our future. It is not giving us any kind of warning about anything. Unfortunately, it's a very graphic book, so a lot of artists and movie directors and storytellers have used the imagery of Revelation. It's fantastic in that regard, but that is not theology, and that is not history, and that is not the reason this book exists. So over the next 5 weeks, we're going to go bit by bit through the book of Revelation, take a look at what was going on in the text, take a look at what was going on in the wider historical context, and take a look at what the listeners of the day probably read in this. This text was so concerning to some people down through history that it was often disregarded. Martin Luther wanted it out of the book, out of the Bible completely. So it's not just us who struggles with this. So if at the end of this you still aren't sure how Revelation sits with you, that's perfectly fine. There's not going to be any rounded up answers and tied in a bow on this. Revelation is a very difficult text to go through. It is not a warm and fuzzy. There is a lot of incredibly sexist language going on, and we'll unpack that too, and how we can possibly make that a little more palatable without ignoring the damage that it has done. Anyway, I'm glad you joined me, and we will continue. The supplement is available for you. It just touches on a few of these issues briefly. It is not a transcript of this, obviously. It's a supplement. It's something you can go back to just kind of get your feet wet about what is going on with the history and the setting of Revelation. And we'll continue that through this study. The videos and the supplemental are to go together. One is not superior to the other. It's supposed to be a match set. Thank you, and we will continue this next week.